Representative Lee's repeal of the 2002 authorization of use of military force that the administration is using as justification, Representative Khanna's important amendment to the NDAA, which was stripped out. Both of these were stripped out by the Senate to say we're not going to continue to provide more funds for this war, and a strong war powers resolution. That is our belief of what needs to happen at this moment, and we've been working very closely with leadership on that. We think it is essential that that work happens this week, in the very immediate near term, because we understand that the threat we face is significant. You will hear later from Representative Lee. And I think all of us remember, and I certainly cut my teeth as an activist working on that Iraq war, standing up and speaking in front of 50,000 people in Seattle at the time to protest the war in Iraq, which also was on the false premise that there were weapons of mass destruction. If there is evidence there, we have not seen it. There is no raw intelligence that was presented to us, and we continue to see that this seems to be just the reckless actions of a president who believes he can act without congressional authority and putting our country and our troops and global stability at great risk. We cannot go to war with Iran, and we must do everything we can to stop that from happening. With that, let me turn it over to my co-chair, Representative Mark Pocan.
Thank you very much, Pramila. Thank you for everything you do for our caucus. So at the core of the values of the Progressive Caucus is peace and justice. Clearly, this is something we have been trying to have diplomacy for a very long time in many areas, especially in the area of Iran. Many of us were involved with the JCPOA when it became law. And we just left a classified briefing, and I think many of us left with the same questions we came in with and didn't get more answers on the imminent threat. In fact, every time we were told, absolutely, there's an imminent threat, you should just see the information. It's really imminent. And nothing was shown to us. And over and over and over, the question was asked, and nothing more was given to us about this. And the real problem is the president has broke his trust with the American people and with Congress on so many issues. It's very difficult to trust him. Just days before the assassination, he said all was well with Iran, and then days later we have the attack that happens. We have had him over and over do actions that have put it at greater risk. The JCPOA, for example, had us in a much better place, in a safer place in that region and in the world because we had an agreement going forward. By getting rid of that agreement, we have seen things happen in the region that didn't need to happen because the president had a bad decision, and we're living with that over and over. The president said he was going to end these endless wars and bring troops home. And in the last 6 months, depending on the number you look at, 14 to 15,000 more people are in the Middle East right now than they were 6 months ago. Again, leading to distrust on this president and his understanding of this region. And we have, as a Progressive Caucus, especially leaving this briefing where, again, no information was given on the imminent threat. What we were told, and this is something I think you've all been told, as this decision was made on Article 2 and on the 2002 AUMF. And they're continuing to say that is the rationale plus information they have, which they have yet to give to us. When I went to the SCIF this morning and read the thin 2 pages of information, there was nothing in there that described an imminent threat. And out of all of this, we are in a less safe place. So the Progressive Caucus has endorsed the following: a strong war powers resolution, some form of resolution that gives the power explicitly back to Congress to do what we are supposed to do per Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Second, we have endorsed Representative Khanna's efforts that we had tried to do in the NDAA to explicitly say we're not going to get involved in Iran. And also we have endorsed Barbara Lee's efforts to repeal the 2002 AUMF, which I might add, Barbara, we tried to do an appropriations committee a few years back, and virtually every single person congressperson, Democrat and Republican on the committee, voted to do that. And it went to get to the full Congress, and Paul Ryan single-handedly took that out of that bill, and we could have had this taken care of a long time ago. But those are the efforts that we are recommending. We are not satisfied. We have been given information that is compelling, imminent threat information. We are not convinced that the president acted correctly, and that's why Congress has to, after quite a long period of giving up our jurisdiction, take that back, and that should be done in a bipartisan way. With that, I would like to introduce a woman who's been really at the forefront of, I think, all of our times in Congress on peace and justice issues, who has been the hardest and strongest voice when it comes to repealing the 2002 AUMF, and that is Representative Barbara Lee.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our co-chairs, Congressman Pocan and Pramila Jayapal, for your tremendous leadership on so many issues that really have become issues that are quite central to our Democratic caucus and should be bipartisan, actually, in many, many ways. So I want to thank you all for your leadership. I also want to associate myself with all of the remarks that have been made already, and also just say how relieved I am that our military personnel, Iraqis, our allied forces, that there are no casualties so far as we know it. And this should be a wake-up call in terms of the cycle of violence. It has got to stop, and we must de-escalate. Let me go back very quickly to the 2002 authorization to use military force. First of all, probably less than 25% of members of Congress here today were here in 2002, and which means they have not had the opportunity to voice their opinion or cast their vote for any authorizations to use military force for their constituents. The House passed the 2002 authorization to use military force based on the Bush administration's beating the war drums, indicating that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was the basis upon which that 2002 resolution was passed. Myself, I introduced an amendment to that said, look, at least let's wait until the inspection process is completed. Let us determine whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before we move to authorize the use of force. Well, from what I remember, I got maybe 72, 73 votes on that amendment. Had we voted to hold up and to wait until the inspections process was completed, we would have learned that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But the Congress, unfortunately, in its rush to judgment, voted to authorize. However, there were probably 132, 133 votes, mostly Democrats, who voted against that authorization. And so that authorization never intended, even as bad as it was then, given that there were no weapons of mass destruction, never authorized the use of force against any country, any hostile country, or any country that was based or had personnel or officials or a presence in Iran or any other country. And so that is why we've worked for years and years and years to repeal the 2002 authorization to use military force. And as Congressman Pocan just mentioned, we did this a couple of years ago. And of course, then the Trump administration, along with Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, just took that out of the bill. So fast forward to just last year, we were able, with the vote of, I believe it was about 241, 242 votes, bipartisan, put this repeal once again in the National Defense Authorization Act. That passed the House. It went to the Senate. Senator McConnell, the Trump administration, again conspired together, and they took that out of the bill. And so a couple of things about that. U.S. deployments and operations carried out pursuant to the 2002 AUMF that was dubbed, remember, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that officially ended in 2011. We should have never been there. But the United States then did recognize the sovereignty of Iraq and considers the Iraqi government a key ally. So we've known for years that there's no military solution in the Middle East, and it's time to return to a diplomatic strategy with our allies. Yet we have Secretary Pompeo, who's the chief diplomat, he's the Secretary of State, acting as if diplomacy is not part of his portfolio, unfortunately. Finally, I just have to mention a couple of things that the Department of Defense, their statement on January 2nd, in terms of imminent versus non-imminent versus Article 2 versus the authorization to use force, what they said, and this is their official statement. They said this strike was aimed at deterring future Iranian attack plans. No mention of imminent threat in the Defense Department statement. It says the United States will continue to take all necessary action to protect our people and our interests wherever they are around the world. My question is, did they mean based on prior hostilities? Did they mean this was an imminent threat, or did they mean future Iranian attacks in terms of their justification? So we need to repeal the 2002 authorization, and we need to force the Congress to come back and debate the costs and consequences of the use of force if, in fact, we're going to continue down this track of military actions against Iran. And so, having said that, I'd like to introduce now a key leader in this whole effort who has worked so hard to make sure that we deny the funding to the administration as it relates to the military action that is taking place in Iran unless they come to Congress for authorization. Congressman Ro Khanna, thank you very much.
It's an honor to follow Barbara Lee. I often say if a sequel to Profiles in Courage is ever written, Barbara Lee would be chapter 1 for her solitary vote.
Amen. Yep.
Let's also be very clear. If the Congress had listened to the Progressive Caucus, the killing of Soleimani would never have happened and the escalation would never have happened. So the lesson is that Congress needs to listen to the Progressive Caucus more often. But we fought collectively, everyone on this stage fought for two things. We fought to say that you would repeal the 2002 authorization of force, the very justification that the administration is relying on. And we fought to say that you would have not a single dime to take an offensive strike against Iran or any Iranian official. And the remarkable thing is that passed the House with 27 Republicans, with people like Matt Gaetz, Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, the president's closest allies. And our leaders, Mark Pocan and Pramila Jayapal, said that do not give a blank check to the Pentagon for $738 billion without a restriction and a commitment that they won't go into Iran. Now, does anyone believe that the Pentagon would have given the Soleimani killing as an option if they hadn't gotten their $738 billion? The day we gave them the money without any restriction is the day they thought they had a blank check. And we now know why they fought tooth and nail to get those amendments removed. Because they wanted the flexibility to have the freedom to plan at any time, at any place, an attack on Iran. Now, why does the history matter? The history matters because at some point, Congress needs to learn our lesson and actually step up and say that we have the power of the purse. We have the ability to defund any offensive action against Iran or any of these wars. And that's what the Progressive Caucus is fighting for. We are making a very simple point. People say, well, what is your policy in Iran? You're just for repealing things. You're just for defunding. No, we have a very clear policy. End the maximum pressure campaign. Get back into the JCPOA. Responsibly remove our troops from Iraq and from Syria. Make sure that we're engaged in a ceasefire, as Representative Jayapal talked about, and diplomacy. We know that was working. It was working under the Obama administration. So we have a clear policy, and we understand that, the Iranian economy, this is what I find mind-boggling for a president who talks about pivoting to China. The Iranian economy is 0.44% of global GDP. We're at 21% of global GDP. China is at 15%. Future historians are going to scratch their head and say, what in the world were we thinking? To be obsessed with a region that's 3.5%, the entire Middle East, of the global economy. Well, China hasn't been in a war since 1979. And we've been in nearly 40 conflicts. So I believe that the Progressive Caucus is going to articulate a new vision of foreign policy for our nation. And it's one that's consistent with a weariness of war overseas and a focus on building up our nation and investing in our country. With that, I want to introduce someone who has shown remarkable leadership along with Representative Barbara Lee and is going to be one of the critical people shaping our War Powers resolution that I think will have broad support in the caucus, Representative Omar.
Thank you, Ro. I feel ill a little bit because of everything that is taking place, and I think every time I hear about conversations around war, I find myself being stricken with PTSD. And I find peace knowing that I serve with great advocates for peace and people who have shown courage against war. In 1946, shortly after the United Nations was established with the goal of preventing future armed conflict, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to his congressman. He said, quote, "You cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war." He said, "The very prevention of war requires more faith, courage, and resolution than are needed to prepare for war. We owe it to the American people to prevent war and not prepare for more war. This is what is needed to keep our country safe. Today, our president is failing to heed the warnings of Einstein. Since he got into office, the president of the United States has been bringing Iran into war. First, he canceled our best shot at avoiding armed conflict, the Iran nuclear deal. Then he announced crippling sanctions to starve the innocent people of Iran. And whether he publicly says he wants nothing to do with wars or that he wants to end endless wars, we know that his actions are contradictory to his statements because every single person he surrounded himself with has been itching to go to war with Iran. And this is a man who is both an arsonist and a fireman. He starts a crisis, then he wants to create the appearance of wanting to solve it. He's done that here. Our ability to fight ISIS has also been eroded because of the suspension of the Iran nuclear deal. The occupant of the White House has not done a single thing to stabilize the region. He has done everything to create more tension. We are no more safer today than we were yesterday. There are basic questions that still exist after we went into our briefing. Did the intelligence support an imminent attack? As you've heard from my colleagues, we did not get a clear answer to that. Did the elimination of Soleimani eliminate the threat? We still have not heard a clear answer to that. Did we take precautions to make sure American troops and personnel on the ground were protected before carrying out this attack? We still don't have a clear answer. Public record has said that we've asked them to evacuate after the action was taken. In what authority were we able to execute and prosecute this attack? It is clear from this briefing and what we have heard from this administration that this attack was motivated by blind ideology and not facts. We know that previous administrations did a cross-benefit analysis on whether to assassinate Soleimani, and their assessment was that he wasn't worth the trouble. That has been the assessment of the Israelis and other allies, as we've learned. Many have wanted the opportunity to take him out and known he is a malicious actor. So what made this different? That it didn't require clear deliberation of what was going to be the consequence and not allow for a notification and consultation with Congress. Why don't we have any of these clear answers? We hope the American people will continue to ask for answers. Instead, we're hearing spin, the same spin that led us into the Iraq War. So you might have noticed that the media asks for a question and moves on without getting a clear answer from the administration. And what we hope is that the American people will not stop asking questions until they have clear answers. We caution against war because our allegiance to this country and our oath to protect it. Sending teenagers to die or return with lifelong wounds, seen and unseen, is not what it is to carry out our oath. Risking a regional or even global war is not what it means to carry out our oath to protect the American people. I always say war does not have a reset button. Oftentimes, people deal with oppressive, regressive, dangerous leaders. War is never the answer to saving more lives. War destroys lives. It takes away futures and it destroys generations. I know this. I've learned that lesson at the young age of 8. And many of the people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and around the world also know this lesson. The world is asking us to act differently this time, and it's our duty to show up and make sure we do. Thank you, and I think we're going to open up to some questions.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our members. And so we're open for questions. And
explain a little bit more about how they're using the 2002 authorization as justification as opposed to the 2001?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara, but I'll tell you the thing that bothers me is that the 2002 authorization is being used to imply that any action that takes place in Iraq qualifies under the 2002 authorization, even though this is against Iran, which theoretically would mean that any country that is within Iraq performing any duty there, or good or bad, would actually be covered under the 2002 authorization. I'll turn it over to Barbara.
No, that's absolutely correct. I have heard some administration officials say 2001 and 2002. The 2001 was 60 words. It was so overly broad until it's been used over 41 times in a declassified report in 19 countries. And so they go back and forth. But generally, I think the 2002 is the one that, because it was Iraq, that this action occurred.
Yes.
Talking to Chairman Engel is going to have hearings on the War Powers Resolution. How far away is the Democratic caucus from coming together on something on this?
I think whether it's this week or next week, I mean, the reality is, one, we have to have language that will make sure that it can get to the Senate. And there are some questions on originally some language around privilege. Secondly, actions like last night, you pause to make sure you're going in the right direction with the right language. So the good news I can tell you is this caucus has worked with leadership, and we feel they're working hand in hand with us on our priorities, which is having a strong resolution, having Ro Khanna's proposal and Barbara Lee's proposal all moving, because all are important parts of this. So we're confident that something will happen very soon.
Thanks. My question is for Congresswoman Elmore. You introduced your own Iran War Powers resolution yesterday. That's the same as, I think, the Kaine resolution in the Senate. Are you working with Congresswoman Slotkin? And can you tell me about what the potential differences are between your version and Senator Kaine's and the one that's being worked on by Slotkin?
Yeah, the resolution we introduced is the one that's authored by Senator Kaine. It's duplicate. What we know, there is a commitment to moving a resolution, whether it is coming together on the one that I already introduced or figuring out an alternative option is yet to be determined. We know that Representative Slotkins has a lot of insight into what this war could mean for our country and for the region. And there has been lots of collaboration with the Foreign Affairs Committee, with Slotkin and the leadership. And so we are just going to make sure that the American people understand that we've made a commitment to work on this and that they need to stay engaged to make sure that we fulfill that commitment.
John.
Speaker Pelosi's letter indicated that this would all happen this week, and today Majority Leader Hoyer wouldn't commit to a vote this week. He said it's going to be very soon, but I'm wondering how much patience the CPC has for this to drag on into next week and get further away from the killing of Soleimani. And as it drags out, is there less urgency, and how do you apply pressure to get this moved?
I think we have consistently said this is urgent, and that we want to see immediate action. Now, obviously, as Mark said, we had things happen last night that nobody was expecting, so we had to take a short pause to evaluate exactly what that was. And even as late as last night, we were still looking, as everybody was in the country, to see what was going to happen. So I think we are pushing very hard, and we do believe it will be extremely soon. We have 2 more legislative days in this week. We do want to make sure we get the resolution right, so that we have a strong force of support, and also in terms of the War Powers resolution, so that it maintains its privilege for the Senate. So I think those are very important pieces for us, and we are working with leadership to make sure it happens as quickly as possible. I think that the threat of more actions is something that we are considering as we look at this. We need to do this quickly, because I don't think there's any guarantee that, and there was nothing I heard that said there's a guarantee that now all is well. All is not well on multiple levels, and so we do need to pass this package of bills quickly. Anybody else want to add anything?
I think as important as it is to pause and to reassess, it's also important to know that we are dealing with an irrational administration. And so we have to make sure that we are reasserting our power, and creating an environment where there is a balance of power. And I think we are the House of Representatives. We are Congress. We're held accountable for our actions to the people. This is the people's house, and we hear the calls every single day from the constituents that we serve, who are asking us to do something, and we have the tools to do something, and I believe we will.
Yeah. Representative Jackson-Lee.
Yeah. I think the point to your question is that the CPC and other members of Congress are the armor bearer or the standard bearer for urgency. And I don't think any of the members here or any members that I've spoken to believe that we should cease our urgency. And I do want to reflect and thank all of the proponents of the legislation. I do want to reflect on the AUMF that was utilized for Iraq and also the vote. And I'm very glad to say that I was part of the 132 and also the vote for Barbara Lee's amendment. But I think that the point of that is that is the same war that we're dealing with today. We never solved any problems with AUMF. We left 4,000 plus, maybe 4,400 dead, and over 60,000 who came back injured in some form. And the war never ended. As I recall the language in AUMF, it deals with hostilities in Iraq. It doesn't deal with an incident or a dislike or someone in a car coming in from the airport. That is the danger of not acting. And I do think with our leadership, meaning the leadership of CPC, that we'll come together around specific answers, if you will, or documents, if you will, to vote on, because it's a question of saving lives. I want to finish on this point. As the soldiers left in the last 48 hours, families were confused. Goodbyes didn't even happen. Orders were confused as to what they might be getting into. And what has not been answered overall is not what is happening in Iran or Iraq, but that is the source of our trouble. It is that no one can dictate or determine what proxy actions will take place to threaten the lives of the American people and soldiers. What continent will it be on? What time will it be? And when you have no strategy, then you cannot in any way configure where loss of life will occur. And I'm glad no loss of life occurred last night, but the urgency is that we have to act to save lives. And I think the CPC, and I want to thank you all for your leadership, will be at the forefront of doing whatever we need to do to save lives.
Barbara Lee and then Mark Takano.
Let me just remind you, first of all, the American people do not want another unnecessary war of choice, especially in the Middle East. Secondly, I'm the daughter of a veteran. My dad served 25 years in the Army, Lieutenant Colonel. He fought in 2 wars, and he always reminded me that we should not send our brave men and women into harm's way unless we understand the costs and consequences of that. And that's why it is so important for this administration to come to Congress if, in fact, they intend to use force anywhere in the world, especially now in Iran. Thirdly, let me just conclude by saying I serve as vice chair of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. That subcommittee is responsible for non-military solutions, preventing wars, development. We have 3 pillars of our foreign policy: development, diplomacy, and defense. And I have to reiterate again, Secretary of State Pompeo is the Secretary of State. And when you look at the course of action that he has in many ways led, and we have to ask the question, how can we begin to mount a diplomatic initiative to begin to move toward de-escalation and a ceasefire and really do the work that it takes to prevent further conflict in the region, potential further war, and somehow get back to an agenda that seeks global peace and security. And so we have to really understand that this diplomatic initiative that Pompeo should be leading is being undercut by the use of force and what is taking place in Iraq and in Iran.
Mark, and then we'll go back to questions.
Yeah. Just real quickly, I'm Mark Takano. I represent the 41st District of California, and I also chair the Veterans Affairs Committee. And, I see on a daily, I think about this daily, think about it weekly, dealing with the consequences of going to war. And I'm not eager to see our country have to contemplate further addressing of the consequences of war. I will credit this idea with where I first heard it, which was with Mayor Pete Buttigieg, that we need to put a sunset on any AUMF we pass in the future, that Congress needs to return back to a discussion on any current conflict, and it needs to be on the hook for after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years, reauthorizing current operations. That we need to what's happened is a complete shifting of mission from the original AMF in 2002, and this is mission creep on steroids that we're seeing. Morphine, the justification for why we're in Iraq, was about fighting. So now, what was about ISIS now is about Iran. This is a true twisting and perversion of language, and we cannot let go of holding this administration accountable, and I urge you, the press and the American people, to not give a pass and allow this administration to just move on and facilely justify what they're doing.
We have time for one last question, Lindsay.
Would it lose the privilege if they were packaged together, but is there a commitment to do them all at the same time?
They've been working very cooperatively with us to see that all of these ideas move together, whether that means the same day or the same week, I can't say, but within a very short amount of time they would be moving together. And again, we have no reason to believe. Everything has been very cooperative and working with leadership on that.
Thanks, Bishop.
I think it's just,
when we did the Yemen War Powers, when we did the Yemen War Powers resolution.
They can't get the sound.
So, I think that when we did the Yemen War Powers resolution, there was an MTR that then passed and that deprivileged the Yemen War Powers resolution from the Senate. So the Speaker, others have learned from that experience, and that everyone is working to make sure whatever we come up with gets a vote in the Senate, because if it's deprivileged, McConnell won't bring it up. So there's unanimity and urgency, but you have to do it in a way that's not going to make the same mistake we did when we did the original Yemen War Powers.
Lindsay, the problem is they won't tell us from the Senate if something is privileged until they get it. So you can't get the information ahead of time, so you've got to draft to what you think will be privileged, and that's part of the challenge.
There's also a conversation moving it on the Senate side first and bringing it here.
All right, well, thank you very much,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Yeah, appreciate being here.
We don't want to move on to Senate first.
waad ku mahadsantihiin daawashadiina is arag maqal dambe oo xiiso leh insha Allah like ta iyo subscribe ka oo xaqiina